Thank you very much, Russell. Welcome everybody to this ELS training event. It's great to be back and doing these kind of things, and one day we hope to be able to see people face to face, but Zoom provides a really good platform for us to do this. My name's Simon Baker, and I'm the chair of the ELS training group, and we are together a number of colleagues across practitioners in church law, and we put together various training events and have done for a number of years now, and this is the latest. And so we welcome people from all over who've come to join us. You may have wondered about the title of this event. You couldn't make it up. The subtitle, I hope, makes it a bit clear: Good Governance in Parochial Ministry. But the title came from one of our colleagues who spent a long time as a church law officer, and he had seen so many strange practices undertaken by PCCs and APCMs. His view was that you really couldn't make it up. And now I'm sure in your context, it's all absolutely above board and absolutely fine. But we do know that there are some funny stories under the surface. But our main aim today is to make sure that we, if at all possible, make PCCs and APCMs do what they're supposed to do and be part of the good governance of our church. And one of the reasons why we're presenting this particular programme today is that the 2020 church representation rules came into effect in January 2020. And of course, we can think back that far now. In March, we went into the first lockdown, and churches for 2 years have experienced all kinds of changes of condition and ability to do things. And that's included PCCs and APCMs and so on. And so we're perhaps quite aware that some people weren't necessarily caught up with the changes in those rules. And there have been some additional changes since then. So that's really at the heart of what we're going to do. But we're going to begin, excuse me, with some thinking about why a church needs to have good order. There are one or two housekeeping notices before we begin. First of all, could I ask that you limit the chat to really just directing questions about what you see and hear to me. I'm going to try and coordinate and collate the questions for our question and answer session at the end. You'll see me down as co-host in the chat facility. If you'd just like to send a question to me, that we will see if we can get the questions to the whole panel later on in the event. And if we can't actually answer a question for you, we're going to try and do some background work on things, and we will post the answers up and circulate them around afterwards. Having said that, could I just make everybody aware that this isn't a legal consultation, this is a training event, and therefore the kind of things that we're offering are in that spirit, even though we've got some very expert people among us. If you have a particular issue, please do consult your registrar or other legal authorities so you can get specific advice about your particular situation. I think that's probably all that I need to say in beginning, except to lead us in prayer as we start, and slightly importantly, really, I thought the prayer, a collect for peace, would do as our opening prayer, since one of the things that we are about as Christians and as Easter people is about bringing peace and reconciliation, and not least through the way in which we govern the common life of the church. So let us pray. Almighty God, from whom all thoughts of truth and peace proceed, kindle, we pray, in the hearts of all the true love of peace, and guide with your pure and peaceable wisdom those who take counsel for the nations of the earth, that in tranquility your kingdom may go forward, till the earth is filled with the knowledge of your love, through Jesus Christ, your Son, our Lord, who is alive and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. Well, I think that brings us to the end of my introductory remarks and our welcome. We now begin our first session, and it's a delight to have with us the Reverend Dr. Andrea Russell, who is Director of Ministry in the Diocese of Oxford, and she's going to set out a little bit of background before we get into legal nitty-gritty as to some of the things that lie behind our understanding of church law and why it is that we need the rules and regulations that we're going to look at in a little bit more detail later on. So Andrea, it's over to you, and delighted to have you with us.
Thank you, Simon. So nice to be with you all. It's always very strange, isn't it, to be chatting. The only people I can see are my colleagues, which is Louise, Norman and Simon, which is lovely because I haven't seen them for a long time. So for a while, when we've put on these events, we've not just wanted to think specifically about the rules and the questions that come from this, but actually something about why, asking that deeper question about why. And when we start to ask that question about why in relation to church, this is often to do with what has God got to do with this? What is this about what does it mean to be Christian in this particular way? And so we start to do God talk, we start to do theology together. And so for those of you who are just waiting for Louise to answer all your questions, I'm sorry, you just got to cope with a few minutes of me first, and we'll see where that goes. So I'm just going to share a screen with you, a bit of a PowerPoint. I'll try and keep to it. I can't always promise to do that, but I will try. I'm hoping everybody can see that. Norman, Louise, can you nod for me? Fabulous, thank you. So we're looking at this idea of good governance and in parochial ministry, and thinking about God's ordering. And oh my goodness me, as soon as we mention the word God, we're bringing in some interesting ideas there, aren't we? We're not trying to say this is the final word on this, but we are trying to say, in what way do these rules, these processes, these ways of working together, in what way might they reflect something of who we think God is and what God's revealed to us about God's self, and how we understand each other in relation to that? So that's where this is going. So one of the things that's often said, and before I came here to Oxford, I spent the previous 10 years in theological colleges, training ordinands and also working with incumbents. And often the sort of pushback to some of church law, to some of the processes and governance around us would often be, particularly the second one here, I'm more interested in mission. I'm not interested in law. I did notice that I think in the chat, one of my ex-students just got in touch with me. And so I'm really sorry, Derek, you're probably going to hear some things that you've heard before, but there we go. I'm not interested in law, I'm interested in mission. This is all very slow. It's trying to hold us back. Who makes these rules? And if we just keep doing these things, we'll never get things done. And one of the things that we might want to say in response to that is, actually, there's something in these rules, in the canons, in the wider ecclesiastical law, that is about our covenant together of how we want to be together. And that itself is missional. That itself says something about the way we think God interacts with us and the way we think that God wants us to be together. We're going right back here, so don't worry, we're not about to go on a huge, great lecture about creation. But actually, we might want to think about the fact that as Christians, we often think about law and grace as being separate. And actually, when we look back at those early chapters in Genesis, one of the things we start to see here is the fact that law and grace are woven together. That actually, when the universe is created out of chaos, or that God creates order, is about the movement of God to create the world is out of love. This is about the way that divine love shows itself amongst us. Now, we often think about law as being more about how we make up for failures, how we when things have gone wrong, how we can make them better. But actually, if we think about the way that we might think about nature's law, about the way the world works, that's not about things being failure and then we've got to make them better. This is about explaining to us the best way that things work together. And there's something here about creativity and something I'm really hot on, which is about covenant. Law in its best sense is about us coming together and agreeing ways of living together. One of the comments that often comes is the fact that law is constraining. And this is often why we get the idea that actually it's not about missional, it's not about mission. And that law itself is about control, making us behave in certain ways so that those in power and authority can contain folk. And we have to say, don't we, that it's not just as a nation that we've done that, it's also as a church. And I'm not trying to deny the fact that we've sometimes had laws that have done just that. But I want to suggest that when we think about law in this way of divine love, in this way of covenant, in this way of coming together to live well together. So good ordering is not simply about do it my way or do it the highway. That law is something about how we come together. Then we start to approach this in a different way by thinking, if the gospel is about God declaring God's love for all, and if when we read the Gospels, we notice that Jesus particularly goes to those people who are oppressed, who are excluded, who are kept out of mainly the religious life of the world that he was in, then we start to say that God seems to be asking us to listen to people who have previously been silenced and excluded. So one of the ways that we might think about good order and good governance is the fact that it's not about keeping people quiet. It's actually about allowing there to be space for those who are normally silenced to find a voice. Now, this can be fun because you're now thinking about your APCM, some of you. I'm wondering how we do that well together. How do we allow space for those who sometimes don't speak, and how do we make sure that those who always want to speak perhaps step back a bit? But that's what good order brings us to. That's what the accountability bit is in here, that we offer to ourselves the space for the other to speak. So here on this side, you can see it's got something about law as not the servant of the powerful, but about protection of the weak and the marginalized. So rather than this incredibly tight understanding of law as control and law as something that remedies sin, although it can be used in that way, this is something about mutuality and generosity towards each other that reflects the very generosity and grace of God. So as we go through this time together, and we talk about all the nuts and bolts and how it can get really quite tricky, one of the things to keep asking ourselves is, does this deliver for us that wider gospel understanding that we want to say that there is place and space here for all? And are we protecting those who are often weaker and marginalized within our communities together? It might be worth just having a brief moment on this as well. So something about the way that law changes. Now, I'm guessing that partly you think, my goodness me, please no more changes. We don't want change. We won't just cope with the rest. And this is something about the fact that our laws change as we start to realize that we want to live differently together, and how we're going to do this better. Now, sometimes this works for us and sometimes it doesn't. But we've put some sort of ideas here. This idea that actually it's about values and virtues. This is about corporate graces. And that the idea that law is not against the work of the Spirit, but can actually be itself a work of the Spirit. So I suppose what we're inviting you to think about as you're with us this evening is not simply the minutiae and the processes and ensuring we do this well for some sort of reason over there, but actually that if we do this well, this will say something about the way that we want to live together as people who believe that God is gracious and loving and that God welcomes all within the sphere of the church. And how do we help our governance deliver that? So there's sort of some quite big things, aren't they, to be thinking about right at the beginning when you're trying to get your questions ready for the chat. But I'm going to come in again towards the end to say, in the light of some of these ideas, how have we worked through some of that during this evening? So hopefully that's whetted your appetite. And I'm going to stop sharing the screen now and go back to you, Simon. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Really interesting introduction, and I think it really gets us back to the basics of our common vocation, our calling, to be people who live in the light of the gospel. As an ex-archdeacon, I know that church law doesn't always go down well, except for the fact when people kind of want to rely on it. It can suddenly become the thing that you find is your best friend, and maybe some of you out there have got a similar experience. And before we just move into looking at the church representation rules and how that's all changed, what I really want to say is that we've actually been through a very difficult 2 years, and some of the questions about who's been able to participate in the life of our church and who hasn't are really quite serious and important questions as we want to move forward into whatever happened next. Because as I'm sure everyone's aware, not everyone feels entirely confident about coming back into church, about coming back into face-to-face meetings, about doing things in the ways they've already done before. And I think all of us are now being challenged to find more inclusive ways and to make those inclusive ways part of our settled way of doing things rather than just novelty for a time. But it raises some very big and challenging questions. And I hope that what Andrea shared with us this evening so far will help us to begin to think about it. And you may well want to be able to take some of those things back to your own PCC and to your APCM when people start to say the kind of things that were on the first slide, that this is all about restriction and it's all about slow process and not about mission. Anyway, without further ado, I'm delighted to welcome Canon Norman Boakes, who is currently assistant priest in the parish of North Stoneham and Bassett, but has in the past been a CME officer and the Archdeacon's training officer, and has his finger on the pulse of quite a lot of these things. And he's going to take us into the first bit of the church representation rules as they currently stand and have been adapted. And he's going to be joined, I think, at the end by Louise Connacher, who is the Registrar of the Province of York and the Diocesan Registrar of York and Sodor and Man. And she's going to do a further session later on in the evening. But we're going to start with Norman. So Norman, welcome, and we look forward to what you're going to share with us.
Thank you very much, Simon. That's very kind of you. And thank you to Andrea. It's always really very good to be reminded that law is not just about being legalistic. And indeed, there's a sense in which when it is legalistic, it really is missing the point. It is meant to protect us all and ensure that everybody is treated properly and well, to prevent bullying and authoritarian practices, to ensure that people are properly consulted and involved, and that this has its roots in our theology, that as a church we are the body of Christ, the people of God, and a sign of the kingdom. I'm going to be talking to you a little bit now about the church representation rules and then the church warden's measure. And then Louise will come in to talk about some of the recent developments which she's been involved with quite a lot in her role, and going to highlight those because they may be of interest to you. And then after the break, Louise will come back and talk a bit more about what's involved in being a charity trustee, which of course all PCC members over the age of 18 are. So if I can get the technology to work now, I am going to share my screen with you, and we will go through this section. Now, the key legislation that underlies this, excuse me a moment. This doesn't seem to be moving. It seems to have frozen. There we are. The key legislation that underlies this goes back to the Church of England Assembly Powers Act of 1919, which was when the Houses of Parliament gave to the Church of England the authority to govern itself. The Church of England still has to refer to Parliament and allow Parliament to scrutinise what it does, but actually we now control ourselves. And that was followed up by the new authorities in the church with the Parochial Church Council's Powers Measure of 1921, which defined the functions and the powers of parochial church councils, revised, as you can see from the screen, in 1956. And it's been amended by a good deal of legislation ever since. Most importantly, the Synodical Government Measure of 1969, and in Schedule 3 of that we find the Church Representation Rules, and then the Church Warden's Measure of 2001. More recently, the Church Representation and Ministers Measure of 2019 has given us some new Church Representation Rules of 2020, and there have been just 4 small but significant amendments for those areas which have done since then. What is the role itself of the Parochial Church Council? Well, overall, the Parochial Church Council is the governing body of the parish. Its role is to set the vision and the strategy. It may be consulted by the bishop or by General Synod on important matters that affect the life and the well-being of the whole Church of England. It is a body corporate. That means it has a legal identity. It exists in law, and that's quite important for the members of it. It is also, under charity legislation, a charitable body, whether it's actually registered as such or still currently accepted from registration. But it has to act within its remit. In other words, it is solely there to promote the charitable objects. It can't be used for different public or private purposes if they are not part of the life of the Church of England. So the phrase that you often find in parish annual reports is the phrase that's there on the screen for you. To cooperate with the incumbent in promoting in the ecclesiastical parish the whole mission of the church, pastoral, evangelistic, social, and ecumenical. And the detailed things that it does fit within that overall umbrella. So that can be responsibility for financial affairs of the parish, that there are accounting records, annual accounts, that there's good practice, that the accounts are independently examined or audited. It has a responsibility to do things like frame an annual budget and to receive regular reports on the finance, a duty to care for the fabric of the church and for its goods. If there's a churchyard, to care and look after the churchyard. It can acquire, manage and administer property for church purposes or on behalf of the parish, can make representations to the bishops on any matter affecting the life of the church. It has to provide the essentials for worship. And there are certain changes in the life of the parish which cannot be made without its agreement. And this is the form of service that you may use, if it's other than the Book of Common Prayer, the version of scripture you may use, or the clothes worn by the ministers when they're leading public worship. In most parishes, anything that is of major importance is discussed by a parochial church council, and it should be. And of course, at the end of the day, it's the parochial church council which will decide the finance for anything that happens. Moving on now to the church representation rules themselves. As I said earlier, there was a substantial revision of them in 2019. And so we had new rules published in 2020, which Simon has already referred to. And the aim behind these rules was responding to a request that we should simplify some of the processes and that we should introduce rather more flexibility. These rules are very much better laid out than they used to be in the past, and it's easier to find the relevant information. I would still recommend, though, that if you want to look something up, rather than flicking through the rules, you go to the index and follow up all the page references under that subject, because sometimes what you need is in two different places in the rules. And if you just do it from one of them, you can go astray. So do, if you're looking things up, carefully look at the index and the different parts that you have to look at in the rules. The new rules then are what we're now talking about. They have recently been amended, and later this month or early next month, there are 4 minor alterations, and they will be in the new rules for 2022. But these rules, the 2020 ones, remain substantially the ones that we're now using. They govern mission initiatives, online voting, term limits, and many more things besides. Now, the basis of church governance is the electoral roll. As a church, of course, we regard our members as all those who have been baptized. But if we're going to have a governance in which people can take part and that's going to work, we need to have a sort of base knowledge of who those people are. So the church electoral roll, the parish electoral roll, is the way in which people become part of our governance. This roll has to be drawn up from scratch every 6 years. And in the intervening years, it has an annual revision, which is timed to be just before the annual parochial church meeting. The 22 rules simplified the processes in which things will be done. You can now store the roll electronically, if that's what the PCC agrees. And in the published roll, which has to go up at the back of each church in a parish, only the person's name now needs appear. This enables us to fit in much more with the general data protection regulations. The full details, though, of the person's address and their email address, if they have supplied it to us, means that we can keep those on the full roll, which is kept safely by whoever administers this in the parish. When an individual chooses to provide an email address, any communication that needs to be made under the church representation rules can now legally be made through email rather than having to do stuff through paper. And this is why for most people now, the PCC minutes, agendas, papers are all sent out by email. The annual parochial church meetings, a few people will already have held them, and all of us now are required to hold them and we have to hold them now by the 31st of May each year. It used to be the end of April, but the 31st of May was brought in largely to allow parishes to get their accounts together. A lot of pressure in some parishes would found it difficult to do it by the April date. And this is when it's the parochial church council that reports to those who are on the church electoral roll about the mission and the activities of the previous year, and including presenting the accounts for that previous year. The new requirements have simplified how those accounts may be published and made available. Now, it's worth stressing that the accounts are the accounts of the parochial church council, so they are approved by them and become part of the annual report, and are simply presented to the annual parochial church meeting. Now, the annual parochial church meeting receives them, but it does not have to approve them. It is open for anyone who is entitled to attend a meeting to ask any question or raise any matter that they wish at the meeting. And they can do this through questions at any stage of the meeting relevant to the various sections. So many places that can happen under the general representation of the annual report. It's also possible for people to propose subjects and indeed motions at an annual parochial church meeting, but any motion is only advisory. The decision makings in a parish belong to the PCC. As you can see from the slide, every 3 years, the annual parochial church meeting elects the representatives to the deanery synod, and these elections should always happen before the elections to the PCC, because the deanery synod members are automatically members of the PCC. Unless, of course, there's an occasional vacancy, in which case that may be an election for the remaining outstanding period of a year or two, which need to be served. And also, a third of the members of the PCC stand down each year, and therefore there's an election for those third, plus any other vacancies which may have occurred during the past year. This is the default position under the new rules. If a parish wishes at any stage to go back to the old system of electing all PCC members only to serve annually, then it needs to pass a motion to that effect at an annual parochial church meeting, and it comes into effect at the next annual parochial church meeting. Appoints the auditor or independent examiner, and the PCC decides on the venue and timing of the APCM. That's really quite important. It needs to be a convenient location, and it doesn't actually have to be in the parish. So that's also quite handy, particularly in the multi-parish benefice, and you're trying to perhaps hold a number of annual meetings in the same place at the same time. And no longer does the annual parochial church meeting appoint the sidesman. That is the responsibility of the parochial church council. The church representation rules also give us the information we need about the running of the parochial church council. It governs the membership and it lays down all the procedures that we have. Just a little brief word about some of those. I'm not going into great detail. If you have particular questions, do please put them in the chat to Simon, and he will collate them so we deal with as many matters as possible towards the end of our event today. Firstly, a word about the chair. And my experience is I found some confusion about this. The minister, whether that's the incumbent or a priest in charge, is always the chair of the parochial church council. A lay member should be elected each year when the officers are appointed at the first meeting following the annual meeting as vice chair. The vice chair can chair the meeting either in the absence of the chair or at the request of the chair. Sometimes the incumbent doesn't want to chair something because they wish to speak quite a bit in the debate. And so it's good that the vice chair can chair it. And it's also possible to invite any other cleric who's either licensed to the parish or is a co-opted member of the parochial church council to be the chair. But to do that, you do have to pass a motion by the PCC, the incumbent has to agree, and you have to write to the bishop to ask for their permission. It's quite important that the rules about chairmanship are followed, and there have been some instances when they haven't, and just occasionally, if the chair is not legally the chair, it puts into doubt any decisions that the parochial church council might have made, while a properly constituted chair is not in the chair. Of course, if the vicar, the vice chair, or any other authorised cleric is not there, then the PCC can elect who it wishes to chair the meeting. In a parish where there's more than one church, you can set up district church councils, and there are schemes about how to do that under the rule. And nowadays, bishops' mission orders are very much seen as part of a deanery, and they have representation now on deanery synod, and they each have a mission initiative role, a bit like a church electoral role. There's also now provision about what to do when you do not have enough people on the PCC, or you can't find or have enough PCC officers. Louise is going to say a little bit more about that, particularly drawing on her some of her recent experience at the end of this part of our presentation. Some key points then about the church representation rules. In the new rules from 2020, there are model rules for each PCC, and these apply to all PCCs, but it is possible for a PCC to apply to vary those rules to local circumstances. If they want to do that, they have to come up in writing with what they want. It has to achieve a 2/3 majority at the annual parochial church meeting, and then has to go to the bishop's council for agreement. And this is really to ensure that there is good practice and that nobody's trying to ride roughshod over anybody else. The PCC only needs to hold a sufficient number of meetings to transact its business. In the past, we used to have at least 4. You don't need to do that now. It's just how many do you need to transact your business? And it's possible for the chair to decide to conduct the business by correspondence. And correspondence, of course, includes email, communication. Now, this is designed really to expedite urgent business, but quite a number of parochial church councils were using it during various lockdowns when we couldn't physically meet. And it was really useful that it was there. And so decisions can be made through electronic communication between meetings when necessary. It shouldn't be used, though, by incumbents to try and force through points that they feel strongly about, and they're worried that the PCC may not agree. So again, this is back to what Andrea was saying at the beginning. There should be a theology which underlines us about the way that we behave and relate to each other. And where business is conducted by correspondence, the PCC secretary must report at the next the next PCC meeting and minute that report, so it's properly in the PCC minutes. It's possible now for PCCs in multi-parish benefices and group ministries to put in place a scheme to work together as a joint council. Now, Louise is going to say a bit more at the end, so I won't say too much about that. And one of the other things that's been there since 2020 is that lay members of the PCC must always be in the majority. Now, this means that lay members of the PCC must be a majority overall on the PCC membership, but also they must be in a majority at any meeting of the PCC. So if you get a number of apologies and you end up with more clergy at a meeting than laity, enough of the clergy need to withdraw to make the meeting quorate. And again, this is about our understanding of the church, which is, of course, all of us. It's not just the clergy, and it's important that the clergy role, though it's distinctive and important, does not take over the role of everybody else. And finally, from me, a little bit about the church wardens. Now, the election and appointment of church wardens is governed by the church wardens measure of 2001. And they are elected, of course, not by the annual parochial church meeting, but a rather different meeting called the annual meeting of parishioners. And this has its roots going back in history. Again, this has to be held before the 31st of May each year, and most parishes simply hold the two meetings together, one after the other. Usually the annual meeting of parishioners first, and then the APCM. This meeting is open not just to those on the church electoral roll, which of course is the APCM situation, but to all who are on the local government electoral roll who live in the parish. Though in my experience, that has not always happened, but sometimes it does, particularly if there's a controversial issue going on in the life of a parish and other people decide to come along to a meeting. If they're on the local government electoral roll, they're allowed to be there for the annual meeting of parishioners. Disqualification, again, Louise will say something a bit later about this, and that will be in session 3. One of the important things under the church warden's measure is that those who are standing as candidates to be church warden must be nominated in writing before the meeting starts. You cannot nominate someone from the floor. And that's there deliberately to prevent last-minute nominations, and particularly nominations which are designed perhaps by a particular interest group to try and gain some sort of power. So all nominations must be made in writing before the meeting starts. What if someone isn't an Anglican? Can they stand? Well, if they are happy to make the required declaration so that they're actually on the electoral roll and that they sign the nomination form, then they can stand. That is the requirements that we have. Once a church warden is elected, as church warden elect, they become a member of the parochial church council. Remember that when you're elected, you do not become immediately the church warden. The church wardens elected before stay in office until the visitation, usually held by the archdeacon, sometimes by the bishop, at which they are admitted to office. And only then do they become the church wardens. Church wardens are allowed to serve for up to 6 consecutive years, and then they have to stand down at least for 1 year, unless, of course, the annual meeting of parishioners has decided that they can serve for more than 6 years. But that motion has to be passed a year before it comes into operation. And where there's difficulty about finding church wardens and all sorts of things, the bishop now can waive some of the qualifications. Again, Louise will say a little bit more in a moment. So I think that's quite enough from me for now. And I'm going to put the slide on and hand over to Louise, who will deal with 3 particular areas, which will be, I think, of interest to a number of you.
Thank you very much, Norman. Thank you, Norman. Louise, just before you start, could I just remind people to put any questions they've got? I've received a few already in the chat directly to me, and then we'll give them to the panel at the end. This is just an opportunity to remind people of that. Thank you, Norman. Louise, over to you.
Thank you, Simon, and good afternoon, everybody.
Louise, you seem to have muted. Ah, there you go.
Sorry, can you hear? Yes, is that okay? I'm getting a nod. Thank you. I'm not sure whether you can all see me because we've just realised that we're screen saving on Norman's screen. But anyway, if you can't see me now, you'll be able to see me after the break.
We can see you, Louise.
Oh, that's great. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here, and I'm going to take up some of the points that Norman alluded to during his presentation. And really, the reason we decided for me to look at 3 specific points at this stage is arising from issues that I've had to deal with in my diocesan roles over the course of the last year or so. And I think these really come from difficulties that that different parishes are having, often after the pandemic has hit, where they're just struggling to get PCC members and church wardens. So often people who have been stalwarts of the congregation have found that during or after COVID, perhaps they're not attending church as much as they were, or feel uncomfortable about attending church, or they've just dropped off for whatever reason. So we are certainly coming across these issues more often. So I just wanted to highlight 3 specific areas that may assist when these sorts of problems come up. I am going to be a little bit technical and give you some legislation references, and if you don't get them, do let us know and I can always send them out later. And the reason for doing that is because if you're in a particular situation where you would like to look at this for your own parish, you may want to approach your own diocesan registrar, and if you've got the details, it's going to be a bit easier for them to point them in the direction that you're looking. So the first question here is there anything that you can do where there are only a few PCC members or no PCC members at all, the difficulties that causes, and is there anything that can be done about it? Well, a few things that are worth looking at here. The first one is from the Mission and Pastoral Measure, section 103A, where there are insufficient PCC members to form a quorum, which is 1/3 of the PCC members with a lay majority. So remember always that lay majority that Norman was talking about. It is possible for the diocesan bishop to direct that the minister and the church wardens will form the PCC, or if there's no minister because you're in a vacancy, just the church wardens can form the PCC legally. So that's one possibility. There is also a helpful provision in the PCC powers measure that Norman was talking about. So that's the measure that sets out the powers of the PCC and what it's there for. And in section 8A of that legislation, where there is an office in the parish that is vacant and no express provision in any other legislation allowing that position to be filled, the diocesan bishop again can give directions for the discharge of the functions of that office by somebody else. So, for example, if there wasn't a PC secretary and it was difficult to appoint one, or if there was no electoral roll officer, as examples, the diocesan bishop could appoint somebody to carry out that role. That wouldn't apply to the treasurer because the church representation rules at M20 do set out what you do in the absence of a treasurer, which is, unfortunately for the church wardens, it falls on them. And if there's no church wardens, there's power to appoint. And the other really useful piece of legislation that we've used a lot actually over the course of the pandemic is section 78 of the church representation rules, which gives the diocesan bishop powers to do a whole range of things. The diocesan bishop can appoint somebody to do something where there's been neglect or default on the person who's appointed. So, for example, if there were an electoral roll officer in place, but the electoral roll officer hadn't done their job, the diocesan bishop can appoint somebody else to do that. So that's different from appointing an electoral roll officer, which would be done under the other provisions I was looking at. The diocesan bishop can also appoint people to do things where there's insufficient PCC members or no PCC members. And also the diocesan bishop can make can give directions for other things, like directions for calling meetings or extending time limits for certain things. We used this quite a lot in our diocese during the pandemic, whereby the diocesan bishop extended time for the APCMs to be held last year, and also for APCMs to be held on Zoom. And in fact, we've given a direction this year for that as well, because we're aware that certainly in our diocese, there's still a lot of COVID around, and a lot of people are very concerned about attending larger scale meetings. So it's always worth looking at section 78 and seeing it's quite wide ranging powers. I've drafted a lot of these directions, and you may well find that they've been drafted in your diocese as well. But if people are struggling with wording for that, ask your registrar to contact me. We all know each other, so that's quite an easy thing to do. The other thing with all of those powers is it's the diocesan bishop who has the powers under the different legislation. Now, suffragan bishops work on delegated powers. So if it's to be the local suffragan bishop who's going to be giving these different directions, it's important for that suffragan bishop to have had that power delegated to them. In some dioceses, suffragan bishops have a very wide delegation of all episcopal powers. In other dioceses, they are specifically set out. That's the way it works in our diocese. We have a list of things that the suffragans can do. So it is important that the registrar checks that those powers lie with whoever it is who's exercising the power. The next thing I want to mention, and this is a bit more positive than, oh gosh, we've got no PCC members, we need to do something on an emergency basis. Something which is quite helpful is the new provisions about joint councils. When I say new in the 2020 church representation rules, they are rules M37 to M42. And this is really helpful where you've got a multi-parish benefice, or benefices held in plurality, or a group ministry. In circumstances like that, those different parishes are called connected parishes. And of course, one of the problems is when we've got a lot of parishes together, connected together, normally that doesn't avoid the need for an APCM or a PCC meeting of the different parishes. What it is possible to do is to form a joint council, so that you don't need to have a separate PCC in each parish, because obviously if it's a lot of parishes together and the different congregations in each parish could be quite small, it could be difficult to get enough people onto a PCC. So what the joint council does is enables you to join the PCCs together effectively into one joint council, and that council to conduct all the business of the different PCCs, or some of the business of the different PCCs. And this is done by a scheme. So a document is drafted that sets out which parishes are covered by the joint council. It doesn't have to be all of the parishes in a multi-parish benefice or in a benefice held in plurality. It can be just some of them. But the scheme sets out which parishes are covered. It sets out how the different parishes will be represented, so how people are elected or appointed onto that joint council body. And then it sets out either that all of the powers of the PCCs are transferred to the joint council, or alternatively, some of the powers are transferred. If all of the powers are transferred, then the separate PCCs go into abeyance, which means the incumbent isn't having to organise PCC meetings in lots of different parishes, and the joint council it then runs everything. The scheme has to be properly drafted, which again is where your diocesan registrar comes in. A lot of registrars already have their own templates, but if they haven't, the legal team at Church House has drafted a template covering either transfer of all of the PCC's powers or transfer some of the PCC's powers to the Joint Council, and they also have a set of FAQs which are really helpful. So you need to have the scheme properly drafted. It has to be approved by each APCM of each parish involved, and it's a 2/3 majority is required for that. And then it needs to go to the Bishop's Council and Standing Committee of the Diocese, and they also have to approve it before it comes into effect. So there is a little bit of pain and process to go through, but once you get through that, you will then have a Joint Council with its own rules, procedural rules, able to govern the different parishes that are covered by the scheme. So that's quite a positive thing and worth looking at, to avoid the poor incumbent having to run PCC meetings all over the place. And the last thing I just wanted to cover was what happens when a parish is struggling to find church wardens. And this is something that I've used on a couple of occasions recently. In one of my dioceses, we had a situation where a new church was formed, and a lot of our parishioners, a lot of the congregation members left and went to join the new church, which was outside of the Church of England, leaving the incumbent with very few remaining congregation members, a difficulty in finding church wardens, a difficulty in finding PCC members. And what we did in that case was we looked to the church warden measure section 1.4, which allows the bishop to waive certain requirements for qualification of church wardens. And the things that the bishop can waive are the requirement of a church warden to be on the electoral roll, the requirement for a church warden to be an actual communicant, or the requirement of the church warden to be 21 or over. So they can be waived by the diocesan bishop in order to appoint church wardens really in an emergency situation. And those church wardens will then serve for the remainder of that of that term of the church wardens, for the remainder of the 12-month period. And then at the next annual meeting of parishioners, then hopefully someone may have come forward to be elected as a church warden. But it's something that's worth thinking about. I mean, the one that I've waived in the cases I've dealt with has been the requirement to be on the electoral roll, because what you can then do is see if you can find out someone, either it might be a diocesan officer, it might be someone else in the diocese who perhaps is well known to the archdeacon and who's prepared to give up the time to go and be a church warden on a short-term basis somewhere else. Obviously it carries all the obligations of a church warden with it, but it's certainly worth doing, because it means you've then got the ability to still carry on running the parish whilst you're looking for other church wardens. I guess the issue with these situations, particularly where there's insufficient PCC members or insufficient church wardens and you can't go down the joint council route, the difficulty, of course, is if you can't foresee missional opportunities to increase the congregation, you're then going to be, I guess, looking towards pastoral reorganisation, so that the size of the benefits can be extended and hopefully more people found to form a PCC. But they're just some fairly technical things that I've done in the past that still give you the opportunity to keep the parish going in difficult circumstances. So I hope they provide some help to you.
Louise, thank you very much for all of that. That's fascinating. It is quite complicated, and I just want to reiterate your suggestion that if anybody has a particular issue, that they actually take it to their registrar for some detailed thinking, because it's not just what's in the law, but it's actually what's possible under the circumstances, and indeed what the circumstances require. Could I just say that we've decided on a couple of provisions in the light of what people have asked for. First one is that slideshows and other information will be put on the ELS website in a way that you should be able to find things related to this particular training session. So don't worry too much. It might not go on immediately, but it will be there in a short while. This will also be put on YouTube, so you can come back and refresh things. You can select which bits you want to see again. We're not going to monitor who are the most popular people in that process, but when it goes up on the ELS YouTube, you'll be able to look at things again. And if there are any questions that we can't answer immediately, either we haven't got time for, but we think are important or need a bit of research in the background, what we're going to do is we're going to circulate the questions and the answers to all those who've signed up for this particular event. So hopefully there'll be some good follow-up. So don't worry if you haven't managed to formulate a question. There may well be things that are covered by the questions that have already been asked and hopefully will be answered as we go along. So we now come to session 3, which is the last of our kind of main input sessions, which looks at the PCC and the whole idea of being charity trustees. This is something that's often quite surprising to members of PCCs, and I do wonder sometimes if anybody has actually told people who stand as PCC members that they are charitable trustees, and the way the PCC works comes under charity law. It's probably more obvious to PCCs that are actually registered charities than to others, but as Louise has already said, it applies to all. So we welcome back Louise, who's going to take us through some of this, and she will hopefully be able to screen share and take over at this point. Thank you, Louise.
Thank you. I'm just trying to sort out my screen share, so bear with me one moment. Are we on? Can someone give me a thumbs up? Thanks.
We are.
Thanks,
we are
great.
on.
Thank you. Okay. Well, hello again, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your break. So, as Simon said, I'm going to talk about PCC members as trustees of a charity. So, as Norman's already told us, PCCs are charities. They have been recognised as charities for many years. But there's often a question that I get from PCCs, which is, why haven't we got a registration number? Should we be registering with the Charity Commission? How do we prove that we are charities? So the rule there is a PCC with an income below £100,000 is exempt from registration with the Charity Commission. So they won't have a charity number, but by law, they are recognised as charities by the Charity Commission. That is all well and good, but when you're filling in a grant application or an application for a bank account, often the people at the other end don't understand this specific exemption that we have as PCCs from registration if we're below £100,000 income. One very practical thing that you can all do if this is an issue for you is to go onto the A Church Near You website, locate your own church on that website, and there is a link that you can click whereby you can fill in an online form that's sent off, and then we'll come back to you with a certificate which confirms that you are on the list of churches in the Church of England and that you are a charity, that you're exempt. So do look at obtaining that if you haven't got that and you don't have a charity registration number. The other thing I'm just going to mention now, because it's come up quite a few times in the course of the last few weeks, certainly in my diocese, is that quite a lot of PCCs at the moment are changing their bank accounts because some banks are charging charities now for their banking, and a lot are being asked for Form 75. So if you get asked for a Form 75 when you're applying for a bank account, the response is Form 75 does not apply to the established church, the Church of England, because Form 75 is all about proving that you are a registered place of worship, and we are excluded from that legislation. We don't need to prove that we're a registered place of worship because we are the established church. Again, what I'm advising when we're getting those questions is that somebody at the diocesan office writes a letter on diocesan headed paper confirming that you are a church within the diocese, and you then would send that certificate that I've just referred to when you write to the bank to make your application. So do please try that. I had quite a few conversations with other registrars at the weekend, and that is something that people are coming across, but that seems to be the thing that helps. So that was a little bit of a sideline, but I hope that's helpful practical advice for you. As I say, whether you're registered as a charity or not, you are a charity, which means all PCC members are charity trustees. That means they have responsibility and accountability. And on the flip side, it gives them authority and power to act on behalf of the PCC. And we need to remember always that as PCC members, they are stewards of the mission of the church and of the resources available to the church. That's a public duty, if you like, because you're dealing with other people's money in many cases. So it is an important undertaking to be a PCC trustee member. I just wanted to refer to the qualifications for PCC members. Those of you who've got your APCMs coming up may have seen the forms about these that need to be signed, but I'm just going to remind you, the first thing is PCC member must be at least 16 years old, but under 18-year-olds can't be charity trustees. So if you do have the odd person who's under 18, I was on a PCC when I was under 18, so I've been there. It is possible, but there won't be charity trustees. There must also be an actual communicant, and that is defined in the CRR. So that green booklet that Norman referred to earlier does have the definition of an actual communicant, which is someone who's received communion in the Church of England or in a church in communion with the Church of England at least 3 times during the last 12 months. If you want to know what a church in communion is, check with your registrar or check on the Church of England website. That information's there. Must have been on the electoral roll for at least 6 months, and somebody who is not disqualified, which I'll come to in a minute. And anybody who's standing to be a member of the PCC must sign a form confirming that those qualifications are met. Of course, it is self-certification, but they do have to sign that form. So what would disqualify someone from being a member of a PCC? Well, this falls into 2 categories, really. The first category is anything that will prevent you from being a charity trustee, because we are regulated by the Charity Commission and the legislation relating to charities. So there's a list of disqualifications for charity trustees. I'm going to just say a few of them, but if you needed to know what they are, you can look at the Charity Commission website or section 178 of the Charity Act 2011. So that will include things like unspent conviction for dishonesty or deception offences, bribery, money laundering, whole list of other things. Somebody who's on the sex offenders register, someone who's bankrupt, someone who's disqualified from being a company director, or someone who's been in contempt of court for making a false statement in court. So that's the charity trustee points. We then have the Church of England further disqualifications. So the first of those is if somebody's included in a barred list. The second is if they've been convicted of an offence under the Children and Young Persons Act. And the third is if they've been disqualified from holding office under the incumbent's vacation of benefices measure, which is a very strange piece of legislation. We don't come across it very often, but what that legislation does in part is deal with severe breakdowns of pastoral relationships between incumbents and parishioners, where the incumbent and or the parishioners are at fault in some way. And it's quite a complicated process, and it does involve a hearing before a tribunal, but ultimately the diocesan bishop can disqualify someone from being a member of a PCC. But as I say, that doesn't come up very often. Just remind you as well that new PCC members are required to sign a trustee eligibility declaration and also the HMRC fit and proper persons declaration, something that most incumbents will be aware of, and you can find further information about that on the various parish resource websites. And remember as well that PCC members do need DBS checks and should also complete the appropriate safeguarding training, which your DSA can confirm if you're not sure what that is. So, looking at trustees' duties, I'm going to talk about 6 different trustees' duties, and these come from charity legislation. It's not specific to the Church of England, it's general duties. So the first one is that you must ensure that your charity is carrying out its purposes for the public benefit. So all charities must have a public benefit purpose. Now, you don't need to worry about what the public benefit purpose is, because that's covered in the legislation that Norman was talking about at the beginning. This comes from the PCC powers measure, and it's that phrase that he put up on I think the first or second slide, that the role of the PCC is to cooperate with the incumbent in promoting in the ecclesiastical parish the whole mission of the church. So that is the public benefit purposes for which PCCs are carrying out their purposes and duties. And it is accepted by the Charity Commission that that is acting for the public benefit. So you just need to be aware that that is the phrase we're referring to, and that they're the things that your PCC should be doing. The next point is the obligation to comply with your charity's governing document and the law. Now, those of you who've been PCC members might say, well, I've never seen a governing document for our charity, our PCC. And those of you who've been perhaps trustees of other charities will have come across governing documents, because virtually all other charities do have a governing document that sets out their charitable purposes and the processes that they have to follow and how they elect their trustees and all the rest of it. But we don't need that, because we have got the church representation rules and the PCC powers measure, and the Charity Commission accepts those 2 documents as our governing documents, essentially. So that does mean, as a member of a PCC, you do need to know about the church representation rules, particularly the bits that begin with the rules that begin with M, because they are the rules that are the model rules for PCCs. If your PCC has put a scheme in place to change those rules, then it's whatever's in your scheme. But normally it'll just be the church representation rules and the measure. So do be aware of what they say, certainly what your purpose is, what your public benefit purpose is, and what the church representation rules say. There is then the obligation to act in your charity's best interests. So really, there is a golden rule here for all trustees to act at all times in the best interests of the charity, the PCC, and in good faith. It's a duty of undivided loyalty to your charity, to your PCC. And as part of that, a central part of that, is the duty to avoid conflicts of interests. So conflicts of interests are where somebody puts themselves in a position where they have or may have an interest that conflicts with their duty as a charity trustee. And if a trustee is in that position, they need to take appropriate action. So there will be circumstances in which a PCC member is conflicted. And if that's the case, they have to declare their interest. And often it may be appropriate for them to leave the room. An example might be that a member of the PCC may be married to somebody who is employed as the parish administrator and who is paid by the PCC. And there's a PCC meeting at which that person's salary increase is being discussed, or an item of misconduct, or their terms and conditions of employment. It would not be appropriate for their spouse on the PCC to be involved in that discussion. It would be more appropriate for them to withdraw from the room. But certainly, whatever happens, that interest should be declared. I'll give you another example. This is an example from my own experience, where somebody on the PCC suggested that they didn't think PCC members should have to pay wedding fees if they or their offspring were getting married in one of the churches in the parish. Clearly, that would be not only a conflict of interests, but it would also be a trustee effectively making a profit from their position as a charity trustee, and that would be inappropriate and a breach of duty. The other point allied to this duty is that trustees have a duty to exercise independent judgment, but they will still be held collectively responsible for the decision of the group of trustees. Quite difficult concepts to understand. But certainly when we're talking about independent judgment, what I would say to PCC members is that they need to be curious about what's happening in their parish and in their PCC. I'm never very good at figures, and I hate the meeting where we have to discuss the PCC accounts. But one of the things it's really important to do, if you like me and don't understand all the figures, is to ask questions. That's really important for PCC members. Ask questions, be curious, even if it seems to be a stupid question. You probably find that everybody else is thinking the same thing anyway. But ask the questions, understand what's going on, but appreciate that even if one individual is not happy with the decision, once the decision's taken, they will have collective responsibility for that as a member of the Board of Trustees. So carrying on with the trustee duties, the duty to manage charities' resources responsibly. So this is about using the PCC's money and other assets only to further the purposes of the PCC, to avoid exposing the assets to any undue risk, to avoid exposing the PCC to dangers to its reputation, managing financial risks and managing property all appropriately. So an example might be in a parish where there are a number of employees, and some parishes do have a number of employees, some parishes have no employees at all, but if there are a number of employees perhaps running a youth work on behalf of the parish, maybe at the moment you're saying on the PCC, well, you know, we've got horrible problems with cost of living increases, gas and petrol and oil increases, generally inflationary issues. We want to give our staff an inflationary pay rise, which is very laudable. It's the moral thing to do. But before you run away with that, with that laudable intention, clearly it's important and incumbent on the PCC members to check the finances of the PCC to make sure that that pay rise is affordable, and to project it across the remainder of the year and make sure that it will continue to be affordable. So that's just one example of making sure that you are managing the resources. Sometimes it means asking the difficult questions and the uncomfortable questions and looking at, you know, making uncomfortable decisions that you'd rather not make. Maybe you can't give that pay rise because there simply isn't the money in the funds. And if that's the case, that's the correct answer. Trustees are also required to act with reasonable care and skill, which means exercising such care and skill as is reasonable in the circumstances. Now, this is an interesting duty because it can apply differently depending on who the trustee is. An accountant on the PCC is expected to have a greater knowledge of finances than me. Equally, when I'm sitting on a PCC, as a solicitor with certain specialisms, I have to use those skills and specialisms that I've acquired over the years in my duties as a trustee. So there's a higher bar for me exercising my care and skill as there would be for somebody who's not legally qualified. So that's a bit unusual, a bit of a difficult concept to understand, but you really have to try your best with the best care and skill that you have available to you, and also recognize when advice is required. Obviously professional advice can be expensive, but sometimes you do need to take professional advice by the PCC. Perhaps you need employment law advice, perhaps you need extra financial advice, but you need to recognise when that advice is required and obtain it. And the other thing that you need to remember is that there is a duty on charity trustees to report serious incidents to the Charity Commission. Now, serious incident for the PCC would be, for example, loss of the charity's money. If you had a treasurer who, for example, set up a fraud whereby the treasurer was making up dummy invoices, paying them, and the money was being directed into the treasurer's personal bank account and emptied the coffers of the PCC, that clearly would be a serious incident which would require reporting to the Charity Commission. Other loss to assets, damage to charity property, harm to the charity's reputation can all be included within that specific reporting requirement. Again, if you're in the situation where you're not sure what to do in those cases, often you can obtain advice from the diocesan office or from the diocesan registrar. There is one specific point that you need to be aware of, though, and that is that reporting serious incidents that relate to safeguarding in most cases will be done centrally in your diocese if the PCC has delegated that specific duty to the DBF and via the DSA. So the DSA will usually put them on a bulk reporting return to the Charity Commission. So do check if you're in a PCC whether that specifically has been done in your situation. The final point there on the slide is ensuring that your charity is accountable. So there are some specific requirements for all PCCs, which most people will be aware of. The duty to prepare annual accounts, which are passed by the PCC and then reported on to the APCM. The duty to prepare an annual report on the work that they've carried out over the course of the year, and again, reporting that through to the APCM so that they can see that the charitable purposes have been fulfilled. There's a requirement to send annual financial statements to the diocese, and also for charities which are registered with the Charity Commission, there's further reporting requirements to send financial information and other information through to the Charity Commission. So those all need to be complied with. And the final point I just wanted to talk about is liability of PCC members. People listening to this may decide after they've heard this that they're never going to be a PCC member, for which I apologise. But joking aside, the main principle here is that PCC members are entitled to meet the PCC's liabilities out of the resources of the PCC. There's no requirement personally on PCC members to stump up any cash for anything, for example. However, charity trustees who breach their fiduciary duties, which are those duties we've just looked at, could potentially be held personally liable for losses to a charity if they have breached their duties. So that will only happen where trustees fail to act in accordance with their legal responsibilities as trustees. We've already seen that PCC members are obliged to show a reasonable degree of care in their administration of the PCC's affairs. And if they fail to do that, there is a risk, as I say, that either the PCC or the Charity Commission could take them to court for breach of their duties. I have to emphasise that it's unlikely that this is going to happen to PCC members. Where a PCC member has acted prudently, in good faith, and in a way which has not led them to benefit personally from their position on the PCC, it is highly unlikely in the first case that anybody will try to enforce obligations against them. But even if they do make the attempt, it's unlikely that they're going to be successful. So that's a really important point. There is the potential of personal liability, but it's unlikely. And of course, what what we would always advise PCCs is that they insure their different liabilities. So PCC should be insuring against public liability, PCC and trust indemnity, which is the indemnity given to individual trustees for breach of their individual fiduciary duties, a pastoral care indemnity, and legal expenses are the main areas that you'll be looking at to insure against. But you need, obviously in most cases, you're going to be using one of the ecclesiastical insurers, and they will have a policy that covers all the things that you need to be covered by. So do make sure that insurance is in place. The other point about PCCs is, because they're a body corporate, generally liabilities are enforceable against the PCC, and that includes things like statutory enforcement notices and fines for health and safety and similar statutory breaches. So they were all the things I wanted to cover. I think we're just about in time by a few minutes. I know that we've got a list of questions that have come through, so hopefully we can hand back to Simon.
Thank you, Louise, particularly, and thank you, Norman, for chipping in as well. Can I just reiterate and say, if you've got specific questions which are about your circumstances, do go to your registrar. This is not a legal consultation about particular context, it's much more general than that, but we hope we've given everybody a pretty good idea of some of the ways things can be answered. And I know from my own experience that registrars are unfailingly helpful in trying to find a creative way and legal way out of circumstances and into a better place. So I think we're all grateful for their efforts. I'm going to hand over to Andrea now to kind of give us a final theological thought or two.
It's gonna have to be like a 60-second pause for the thought, isn't it, rather than a sort of thing. I've been really intrigued tonight as I've listened, because often I've talked in these situations about, what do our laws together tell us about how we understand God. But the really bit that's grabbed me tonight has been what are the areas that are concerning us, and where are the spotlights, and what does that say to us about our ecclesiology? What does that say to us about the way we are being church at this particular time, with this particular context, with these particular strains? I loved the bit, Louise, about the fact that the mission of the church is of public interest, and that's all you just need to say. I mean, that, I feel like that's an essay question, please discuss. It's just a beautiful, beautiful bit of encouragement for us that actually the mission of the church, which is to declare the love and the grace of God for all people, is of public interest. I am taking that home with me and sleeping with it under my pillow. That was one thing. The second thing I thought that was interesting was Louise, when, and I think it was you, Louise, it might have been Norman, was talking about the way that the bishop is having to say that some of the qualifications to be a church warden we're having to step back from. So as I go round and about here, I'm in Oxford Diocese, I know that there's, and we all know, there are real issues about electing church officers. And I heard somebody yesterday who hadn't got any church wardens, and it was quite a big church. And if we're thinking about looking at APCMs as places to indicate to us places where we need to pray together, where we need to think together about what is this about? So the mission of the church, if you like, what is this about? And yet I went to a night shelter yesterday that's got 450 volunteers from the local churches. These are really interesting things for us to take into small groups to discuss. And one of my last favourites is, Louise, your little comment that, if you don't understand something, ask questions. I've got this lovely idea of Louise keep putting her hand up at the APCM. But I was roundabout with Bishop Stephen here yesterday, and he's using the story of Jesus and the disciples on the road to Emmaus as being indicative of what we might need to look at as a text to help us to think about renewal in this time of what I'm calling this time of convalescence. And he talked about the fact that asking questions and being curious and listening to each other is at the heart of our renewal as a community together, as a church, as the body of Christ in this particular time, listening to people within the church and listening to people well who don't usually come to church, and being curious. So I suppose my little plea, and it's easy for me to say, is that when people are asking all those tricky questions at our APCM, and we basically want to say, somebody chuck them out, wonder to yourself whether that is a sign of the Spirit at work amongst us, asking questions, being curious and being open to each other. So that's my little pause for thought for the day.
Andrea, thank you very much. Wonderful end. Can I thank everybody, our speakers, particularly Norman, Louise and Andrea, for participating, for Russell for doing the backroom stuff, and for you all for attending. We hope you've enjoyed it. We hope you've benefited from it. All of what we've done will be on the ELS YouTube channel. The slides are going to be on the website, and there'll be one or two other things on the website as well. Do go back to the ELS website, and if you haven't joined the ELS already, please think about joining. There's some good stuff. There's some more online training events and lectures and talks coming up. This one is for free, because we think we've got a real responsibility as a charity to actually help people work well within the life of the church. But do help us to carry on and join the fellowship, which is quite a lot of fun. It's not by any means dry and dusty. We probably spend more time laughing planning these things than we do actually talking about church and law. Anyway, before we go, I think we shall end with prayer, and I again say thank you very much for everybody for being with us. So we pray again for our world and for our church. God grant to the living grace, to the departed rest, to the church, the Queen, the Commonwealth and all people, unity, peace and concord. And to us and all God's servants, life everlasting. And the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son and the Holy Spirit be among us and remain with us always. Amen. Good night and
Amen.
go well. Bye.
Bye, everyone.